Welcome to the Friends Meeting second hour. Matt is going to be going over Faith in Action's next steps for Prop M. We met with Dean Preston, District 5 Supervisor yesterday, and asked him questions about the lawsuit that's been brought against Prop M and what actions we need to take. Part of to move forward, we need to fill out this housing survey that I've sent everybody a link to, and there's a link to in the chat. And then once Matt is done, I am going to do a follow-up on AB 481, the militarization of the police, and the recent development that the American Friends Service Committee is now suing the San Francisco Police Department for not making all of their assault weapons and military equipment on public record. So before we get started, let's have a moment of silence. Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn this over to Matt.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Matt Alexander on the organizing staff with Faith in Action Bay Area. And again, thank you for having me. It was great to be here for the worship and the coffee hour and this conversation as well. So I'll just give some brief background and then we can show this video, which I think tells the story of Prop M in a powerful way. And then, you know, if there's discussion or questions, be happy to talk more. So our, as I think most of you probably know, Faith in Action Bay Area is a community organizing network. We actually have close to 150 congregations, schools, and other organizations in San Francisco and San Mateo County that are affiliated in some fashion, including the Friends meeting here. Art has been a really strong leader in recent, you know, over the past year, but others in the past have been involved, Martha Larson and others. So there's been a connection around our efforts with your community for a number of years. And so you've really, so part of the purpose of this also is to say thank you for your support, because we, you know, what we try to do is we try to use faith institutions and schools and community centers and other places as a path in for collective justice work, really focused on the needs of the most marginalized, of the people that are closest to the pain. And so in San Francisco, a lot of our leaders actually are immigrants. There's a lot of immigrant elders and some immigrant families from Mexico and Central America, principally, a lot through the Catholic parishes and the mission, as well as some other churches in the city. We also did a lot of organizing during the pandemic through food lines, as people were coming to get food, and so there's a number of our strong leaders that are now that came to us through the food lines, and so what we try to do is to build relationships across race, class, language, and role, and then build teams of folks that are working together to basically enact their values in public life and create positive change. And so a lot of our work in the last few years has been focused around housing, because obviously that's the thing that is most impacting low income and working class people in the city and the immigrant leaders that I spoke of. And so there was actually a group of mostly elders, immigrant elders, who 6 or 7 years ago now, really started advocating around housing for seniors, right? Because it's just so difficult for elders in the city. Like there's in the video, you'll see Carlos Valle, who's one of our leaders, who is 75 years old and still working because he can't afford to stop working or he'll be evicted and he has no place to go, right? So the only way he can pay the rent is by continuing to work, even though he's 75. And so, so there's so many people in that kind of a situation. So our group actually advocated for the construction of an affordable housing building that got built by the city at 26 and Shotwell. It's called Casa Adelante, and it's right there on, if you're going down Cesar Chavez near Shotwell, you'll see it. It's a beautiful building that opened in 2019. So the building was completed in 2019, and the applications came out, and the elders were so excited because they were like, "Oh, look! Finally, we've got a building that's for us, right?" And it was 90 units, about 90 units, 91 units, I think. And so people applied through Dahlia, which is the housing application system for the city, and over 4,000 people applied for those 90 units. So that was the first problem, was that barely anyone got one, because, and this is typical of all the city's affordable housing, right? Some, many more people apply than there's actually a place for. But the second thing is that even the people that won the lottery and got places in that building soon discovered that the cheapest apartment, even a studio in that building, was costing over $1,200 a month. And these are seniors that are making $800, $900, $1,000 maybe in Social Security checks for those that have retired. And so the idea that they couldn't even begin to pay $1,200 a month for a studio. And so through that process, we began to do research and try to understand why that was. And the reason it is because even the affordable housing that's built in the city is built using federal tax credits that are pegged to area median income. So they're designed based on a certain level compared to area median income. And so roughly 50%, I think, of area median income is the target for a lot of these affordable housing developments, which for a working class family, that is about right. But for an elder who's on fixed income, it doesn't pencil out. Like, people can't afford it. And there's no additional money to subsidize the rent. So the rent's at $1,200 a month. So that's where our leaders became really interested in this idea of subsidies. So could we layer on housing subsidies on top of these tax credits so that elders could actually afford to live in affordable housing? And so we fought that year and actually won subsidies for half the units in that building. And they were based on the building itself. So the subsidies are tied to those units in that building. So about 40 of the units are now subsidized at an even lower rent level. And a number of Faith in Action leaders are now living there because they happen to have won the lottery, and then they got these subsidies. But what we realized in the process of this whole effort was that the amount of money for subsidies was just way too little. There's over 5,000 seniors living in San Francisco today who are paying more than 70% of their income in rent, and they're at immediate risk of homelessness. And so we calculated that if we wanted to provide housing subsidies for those 5,000 seniors, not in a new building, but in their existing location, to lower their rent burden and allow them to stay so they don't get evicted, so they don't become homeless, it would cost something on the lines of $50 million a year, so we met with all these politicians, we met with supervisors, we met with Mayor Breed. This was all back in 2019. They all said, we love the idea, but we have no idea where to get the money. So it's impossible because there's no money. And so we've been engaged in this question of where do we find the money? And 2 years ago, in 2021, one of our leaders said, why are there so many empty apartments in this city? Because they noticed all these empty units in the buildings they were living in. And we started doing research around that. And then we met with Supervisor Preston, who said, hey, we're actually thinking of putting a tax on these empty units. And we put these two things together and said, hey, that's a great idea. What if we tax these empty units and use the revenue for housing subsidies for seniors? And so that was kind of the genesis of Prop M, and you'll see in the video kind of like how it played out. But it really was years and years of work and looking for a revenue source for housing subsidies. Now we expanded it to not just be seniors, but low-income families as well, because that was really important. And also, Preston was already wanting to use the money for the city to acquire housing, to buy buildings or hotels. We were talking about that, to make hotels permanent affordable housing. So but we negotiated, our leaders negotiated with him, and we agreed that we would use half the revenue for acquisition and half the revenue for subsidies for this tax. And as you know, Prop M was on the ballot last year. It passed with 55% of the vote. And there was over $1 million spent against it by the real estate industry. But this showed that when people come together with an idea, a practical idea, it's not going to solve the housing crisis, but it will move us forward. If the projections are right, we'll have between 15 to 30 plus $1 million a year of revenue that could be applied to subsidies and acquisition. So it's a big investment in affordable housing. And again, it allows landlords, if they really want to keep their unit empty, that's fine. They just have to pay into a fund to help folks that are at risk of homelessness, right? In some ways, it's a great example of public policy that I think is a win-win. Now, of course, they're suing us. There's a lawsuit. This is one of the things we talked with Dean Preston about. The real estate industry is suing, and they're saying it's such a burden for us to have to pay this tax. Like, one of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit is a retired anesthesiologist who has 2 apartments, one in Boston and one in San Francisco. And she's saying, it's such a burden for me to have to pay this tax. Again, showing kind of how out of touch folks are, that, the idea, nobody's saying she can't have 2 apartments. It's just saying if you're going to have one in San Francisco that you don't live in for at least 6 months of the year, you have to pay into a fund to assist the elderly, to assist low-income families. Yeah, we met with Preston, as Art said, this week to talk about implementation, to talk about the lawsuit, but more importantly, how the city is moving forward with implementation. So we're going to be working closely to ensure that the tax is collected, and also that the subsidies get to the people who need them. Because that's the other problem with these subsidy programs, is that they've been really hard to access. So low-income seniors have had a really hard time getting them. Even when you get selected for a subsidy, it's another lottery, right, along with the housing lottery. And then once you get selected, there's mountains of bureaucratic paperwork. There's all kind of stuff, and if you don't meet all the requirements, you get dropped just like that. So we also want to advocate to make sure that the program is more streamlined and really meets the needs of low-income folks, especially immigrants who, there's also the language barrier. So so we would invite all of you and thank you again for your support, and then invite you to continue engaging with us. Art was at this meeting this week with Supervisor Preston. We're going to be meeting with the tax collector. We're going to be meeting with the Mayor's Office of Housing. So it's a lot of interesting opportunities to learn about the system and then support our immigrant leaders as they fight for effective implementation. Art also mentioned the housing survey. That's a statewide effort from our statewide network, PICO California. We have federations across California that are working around housing issues. And the survey is just really a way to start the conversation around what's happening with housing, in our state. And I think we all kind of know that it's a crisis, but to really start defining the scope of the crisis, to understand that it is the most vulnerable who are most impacted, but there's also, middle-class people who may even own a home in San Francisco, but who think, my kids are never going to be able to afford to live here. And so there's just so many layers to how the housing crisis is impacting our communities. And so that the idea of the survey is to really open that up and unpack it, and then come up with additional solutions, both locally and statewide. So, question?
I was wondering, how much is the tax that they want to levy on the empty apartments? Is there a flat rate, or is it based on
the tax is based on square footage of the apartment. Because under Prop 13, it can't be based on value. So it's actually like an excise tax. It's based on the square footage. And so it increases, the larger the apartment, the larger the tax. And it also goes up every year. So, and it's 6 months. So if your apartment is vacant for more than 6 months, you have to pay the tax. There's a lot of exceptions.
So square feet, how many will be the tax?
I don't remember.
I just wonder what they're complaining about.
Well, it is a significant tax. So I think the example in the lawsuit was it was a small apartment. It was less than 500 square feet. And the tax goes up year after year. So in the first year it's less, but by the third year it's like $10,000, which they were complaining was more than their property tax. The only reason it was more than their property tax is because they bought the place
13, yeah.
25 years ago, and under Prop 13, the property tax rate is artificially low. So, but it is a significant tax. But again, the point is that these are folks that can afford to pay a tax, right? And the money is really being then transferred in the form of subsidies to people who are at risk of homelessness. So
the apartments are vacant because people have like more than one place, and they leave this one empty until they come, versus there's living it, say a landlord has and it's a different situation, owner occupied versus just not, they have the, which is what percentage is owner occupied versus just empty because they don't want to rent it out, or
right. No, and that is a big issue of landlords sitting on units. That's a bigger issue actually, of landlords sitting on units because they don't want to rent them out right now because rents have gone down, right? And so they don't want to, especially the rent control, older buildings that are under rent control, they don't want to lock in a lower rent. And then, you know, so they're kind of waiting. So that's something that happens. Or they might want to sell the building. And there's a lot of buildings that are just being held, units are being held empty because they're being traded for speculative purposes, and they're worth more when they're empty, right? Because if somebody does want to rent it out, they have that freedom to do it. So there's a great report. There's a couple of reports from the city budget and legislative analyst, if you're interested in the details, which we can share, that were done last year before the tax passed, on all, it's kind of addressing a lot of these questions. So should we do the video and then?
Yeah.
Okay, so why don't we watch the video, and then if folks have other comments or questions, I'd be happy to chat more.
how long is the video?
It's like 6-7 minutes, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not long.
It's no secret that California has a major housing crisis, and San Francisco is one of its epicenters. Long known as a place that values diversity and respects human dignity, San Francisco is not the city it once was. Today, many thousands live on the streets while countless others live in fear of losing their homes. For years, Faith in Action Bay Area leaders have been working to find solutions that align with our community's values. We learned that San Francisco has 60,000 housing units sitting empty, many being traded like poker chips by global investors. In 2022, we proposed a citywide ballot measure, Proposition A, that would tax empty housing units to generate revenue for housing assistance for those who need it the most. The leaders in our network, who are directly impacted by housing insecurity, began to ask, why? Why in the midst of all this suffering are there so many empty housing units in our city? We learned many were being used as investment properties by speculators, cashing in on our high land values. We also learned that cities from Paris to Vancouver had begun to tax vacant homes, encouraging landlords to rent their units and generate revenue for affordable housing initiatives.
Back in January, when the report came out from the Office of Legislative Analysis and Budget, that there were 40,000 units in the city standing empty, I thought that was crazy. I didn't believe it.
Tuvimos reunión con Marina Marcin, de la tesorera de Canadá, en la cual ella sí nos dio la información cómo se hace posible que obtener de esos edificios vacíos un impuesto, en el cual ese impuesto genera subsidios para que las familias de bajos ingresos y adultos mayores sean ayudados para su pago de renta.
That's just beyond me, that people have enough money to own a building and let it stand empty.
Inspired, mobilized, and activated, we met with San Francisco city leaders until we found one who shared our values. Together, we worked to write a ballot measure to tax empty apartments and use that revenue for housing acquisition and direct housing assistance to low-income seniors and families. We got 14,000 signatures to qualify for the ballot, and then ran a 6-month strategic campaign leading up to the election. Our constant focus, starting with our congregations and moving outward, was on building relationships to create grassroots, bottom-up people power, led by those most directly impacted by the problem.
Y fue allí que nos unimos al escuchar qué podíamos hacer, adultos mayores. Luego esos adultos mayores llevaron la voz, ¿verdad?, a invitación a otras más, y en la semana siguiente fueron 60. Después en la semana siguiente fueron 80. Y así fuimos creciendo.
Es una oficina de que en realidad es de aprender. Vine y conté mi historia. Vivo en un cuartito que desde mucho tiempo me están desalojando, pero como no he dejado de pagar, por eso me tienen allí. Si yo fallo en ese pago, fuera. Aquí ya tengo mucho tiempo de estar trabajando, siempre trabajando. Y hasta hoy no he podido ni tener vacaciones. A esta edad, 75 años, siempre sigo trabajando. Si la medida me pasa, qué lindo fuera. Sería lo magnífico para todas las personas de bajos ingresos.
Years of work, research actions, one-to-ones, good old-fashioned community organizing led to this. 3 weeks before Election Day, we held a rally on the steps of City Hall to celebrate the fact that we had contacted tens of thousands of San Francisco voters through congregational outreach, door knocking, and phone banking. We had finally successfully framed the fight for Proposition M as a moral choice facing our city.
As community leaders with Faith in Action, we bring these stories to the public sphere with a sense of urgency, based on our faith and based on our moral values. Prop M, the moral choice.
Es nuestro deseo y visión que la vivienda sea reconocida como un derecho y no como un privilegio.
Soy una madre inmigrante y durante la pandemia fui desalojada 2 veces, hasta terminar en la calle. Ahora estoy en un hotel en la cual sigo viviendo. Las condiciones de este hotel son muy malas. Estamos infestados de cucarachas. El techo del baño por segunda ocasión se está cayendo. Y esto no es apto para mí y mucho menos para mis hijos. Constantemente soy hostigada para que desaloje el hotel. Y lo que me causa más indignación es que esta situación de hostigamiento ha pasado frente a mis hijos, las cuales me han dicho en varias ocasiones que prefieren dejar de estudiar y trabajar para ayudarme con la renta. Llegué a las líneas de comida, donde conocí a los líderes de Fe en Acción. Empecé a asistir a las reuniones donde vi mi situación de problema como una oportunidad para mejorar no solo mi situación, sino de cientos de familias que están pasando por lo mismo. Porque esta medida M cambiará nuestras vidas al permitir tener un subsidio para poder tener un hogar con nuestros hijos.
And on Election Day in 2022, we offered San Francisco voters more than just empty apartments that could be turned into homes and housing assistance. We offered more than just good policy, common sense solutions. With Proposition M, through our faith-based community organizing, we offered hope. And despite the fact that the real estate industry spent over $1 million opposing it, the Measure 1 handled it with nearly 55% of the vote. At this critical moment in history, the organizing tradition of Faith in Action Bay Area and Pico, California offers us all a path to choosing hope, to choosing faith in a better future as we remake our communities into the places that we deserve, into the places that we want them to be.
I came to San Francisco 22 years ago, a couple of years after I had tested positive for HIV, and I needed medical care that I knew was dependable. When I first came to a Faith in Action meeting, I felt like I had met my people. We are led by people who are closest to the pain, people who are closest to the suffering, people who have seen what's wrong with the system and they know what the system needs. I believe that homes are made for people and people are meant for homes. And that's why I'm voting yes on M.
Tengo de residir en San Francisco, California, 13 años. Verdaderamente, a principio no era lo que esperaba. Fue muy frustrante para mí porque mi madre pagaba casi todo su sueldo en la renta. Esto les traería una esperanza, una ilusión de tal vez cumplir sus sueños, de que ellos pudieran estar aquí en un San Francisco que verdaderamente sea inclusivo, ¿verdad? Sí en AM y sí se puede.
I think all those things play into this. And I don't think Prop M or housing subsidies is going to solve those problems, but I think it is a step in the right direction. And I think one of the things that we've talked about a lot in Faith in Action is that actually, I think the biggest obstacle to this problem is the sense of hopelessness, in the sense that it's just so complicated and there's nothing we can actually do. And so we believe that Prop M is a step in the right direction, and we need to be taking steps, right? And there's probably 15 other steps that need to be taken to address the issues that you raised and others. But if we just say we have to, if we're not willing to take any steps because we're not taking all the steps, we're never going to make any progress. And so I think that's part of what we were trying to combat with Prop M, was to say, look, here's a concrete thing we can do. We know there's 60,000 vacant units. That's not right. You know what I mean? There should, obviously there's some room for vacancy in the city, but there's only like 300 some thousand housing units in the city. So it's like 15% or almost 20% of the housing units in the city are sitting here vacant. Clearly that's not right, right? Even, and so yes, there's some legitimate reasons why they should be vacant. Yes, you know, people have a right to, you know, keep them vacant for certain reasons. So, but that on a large scale, that's not right. So here's the thing we can do, and we can use the rev, we can tax them, still give owners the choice of how they, you know, whether they want to keep them. They can rent them out or they can pay the tax. If they pay the tax, it goes towards some things that take concrete steps in the right direction. So I think that's how we were looking at it. But I think, yeah, I just think your questions definitely are right on and speak to the large scale of the problem.
So it sounds that a follow-up question I had, which it sounds like this vacancy issue is a way of addressing it, is the issue that if we believe that housing is a human right, it seems to me that it becomes another thing that shouldn't be part of the free market. That
yeah, at the end of the day, I think that's right.
You know, and
I mean,
like I look at like Section 8 housing, I mean, the government comes up with a number. You can charge up to this amount for this size of a unit. And if it's new and it has an elevator and it has all these nice amenities, maybe it's more than if it's in a different building that has less. But it seems to me that the feds can do that, of all people, that could be done all over. But whenever I raise that issue, I'm, you know, basically told that it will go nowhere. Oh, you know, we are a capitalist society. But I also have a second question, which I know Arthur really dealt with when he was working in the meeting. And that is around the issue of rent control. And I know personally a lot of people who are afraid to rent, like particularly if there's someone like me who has a house, so I wouldn't be subject to this tax, but it triggers a lot of conversation around the people who get a tenant who's the tenant from hell, and they can't get rid of them, and they never want to rent again and they tell all of their friends about it, and it just seems to me that for this to actually work, there has to be a conversation with those people as well. I mean, there has to be some way of, if it's not a good match, if everything wasn't so expensive, people could just move on. So that's one side of it. So maybe just controlling the cost would deal with what I'm raising. But I do feel like part of those 60,000 units are people who are afraid to rent because they've had a bad experience. And
yeah, definitely. No, I think you're right. And I don't think anyone would argue that rent control is a perfect solution, right? Because it does exactly what you're saying. And it traps the tenant also, right? I mean, how many people do we know who live in a rent controlled apartment who are like, I could never leave. And if I had to leave, I had to leave the city, right? So we all have people we know like in that situation.
They hate their roommates and they hate their partner.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so No, absolutely. And I think what you said earlier, I think is really perceptive, which is that if there was more, you know, like what you're describing with Section 8 is more like, it's not rent control. It's actually a more strict form of rent control. It's saying like, this is kind of where, like what you can
The
charge for this
ceiling.
kind of a, yeah. And if you had something like that, then you could actually maybe lessen the just cause eviction protections, right? Because what you're talking about is just cause eviction, right? If it was easier to evict people, like if all the apartments were under rent control and the prices were all more reasonable, then you could loosen the eviction protections, right? One reason the housing advocates want the strictest possible just cause eviction protections is because of rent control, right? Because as soon as you're kicked out of that rent controlled apartment,
Yeah.
there's nowhere to go,
Yeah.
right? So it's almost like a chicken and egg problem that those things are intertwined, and it is sort of dysfunctional, I think.
Well, and I also think that, well, we have to work where we live. It's also an issue nationwide. I mean, in other places, the number might be lower, but the percentage of their income can actually be higher. I remember reading, it's been a few years ago, but that Miami was actually the most expensive city in the country, in the sense that to cover people's basic needs, it took the most of their income. So even though whatever they're paying might be less, it's still what they can afford. They're hit hardest. Yeah.
Right.
And that, I know this, I also had a question for Art about the robots and the military equipment. I was getting kicked off I just got kicked off about 5 times in a row, and eventually my phone wouldn't let me get back on, period. So I came back and got on my computer. But I was curious, I mean, given how ridiculous this idea was, in the first round of voting, I think all but 2 supervisors voted for the robots. And I'm curious, like, what was their rationale? I mean, it's almost like they all got caught with their hand in the cookie jar, and they just, jerked it out and tried to pretend that they never were near the cookie jar. But what were they thinking? Because it seems like part of advocacy against the robots is understanding what the rationale is for them.
Well, a couple of supervisors thought that, Supervisor Mandelman portrayed this as anti-police, that we're not supporting the police, and that given the amount of violence there is throughout the United States right now, it made some of the supervisors, I guess, feel alarmed that if we were in a situation like the Capitol riots or something like that, we would regret not being able to use these weapons to fight back. So I think it was a bit of hysteria that caused them to initially vote that way. But then Dean Preston pointed out that the police did, propose this on a Friday for a meeting on a Tuesday, and that the law requires at least 1 month of consideration so the public can make comment on it. And then in the week after that meeting, there was so much publicity, both locally and nationwide, that some of the council members changed their vote. And then they voted to just send it back to the Rules Committee. So it's dead for now, but it could come up again.
Yeah, I heard that part. Okay. Yeah, I was just curious what they were thinking. I mean, again, in this, trying to put myself in someone else's shoes, I wondered if there was an argument that if, there's so many police shootings of young people where it's so brutal and so cruel, but it seems like at some level it's fueled by adrenaline and fear. Whether it makes any sense or not is a different issue, but that, like, and some things are just beyond the pale. I can't even imagine why they do it. Power. So I wondered if they were saying, well, a robot is programmed. It doesn't have emotion. So it isn't going to just shoot somebody because somebody didn't stop when you said stop, or because they gave you a dirty look or had an attitude or, whatever gets that adrenaline pumping. So anyway, I'm not supporting it, but I just was wondering if that was in there anywhere.
Well, the robots are going to be controlled by artificial intelligence, which doesn't make me feel any more confident about their ability to work in a contextualized situation. The example that kept being brought up was the Mandalay Bay mass shooter. If we had a mass shooting going on, you could send a robot up there to blow the guy up. But that didn't make a whole lot of sense because you'd be endangering the other people in the building, and we've never really had a situation like that here in San Francisco. So
I just was curious. Yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
So we've had these robots for 10 years now, and they're
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Arthur Koch. I live in San Francisco, District Number 9. I'm a member of the San Francisco Friends Meeting, otherwise known as the Quakers, serving on the Peace and Social Concerns Committee. We believe that nonviolent confrontation of injustices and peaceful reconciliation are always superior to the use of force. Law enforcement and the military also apply nonviolent means before resorting to the use of force and firearms. Only if other means remain ineffective or without any promise of achieving the intended result. In this sense, we have much more in common than differences. I'm here to support you and work with you. So thank you to the Rules Committee and the Sheriff's Department for your collaboration with advocates on this policy and your commitment to improvement and transparency. As a Quaker committed to nonviolence and human rights, I'm concerned about how weapons may be authorized for the use in San Francisco jails and how use in such confined space may impact people detained there. I'm interested in hearing about what kind of increased risk of injury there may be for people in San Francisco jail, or if there's a risk of unnecessary force on innocent bystanders who may be detained there. I'm interested in seeing demographic information on deployments and other uses in the annual report, especially data around location of deployment and race of those present. I advocate for inclusion of private right of action, which means people in San Francisco are affected by violations, and these policies can file a civil lawsuit. Finally, I'm advocating for decommissioning or at least putting real controls on the deployment of fully automatic assault weapons, both pistols and the submachine guns, as well as prohibition on aiming chemical agents, launchers at people. Thank you for this work on this complicated issue.
Thank you.
See you at the Board of Supervisors.
Thank you. Why don't we go to remote public comment? Yes, can we have our first caller?
Good morning. This is Regina Sneed. I'm a resident of District 2. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm very pleased to be able to support this ordinance with all of the work that members of the Rules Committee, the American Friends Service Committee, the Police Department, and the Sheriff's Department staff. I haven't seen today's early 5:50 a.m. draft, but the description provided by Supervisor Peskin reassures me that, in particular, the Sheriff's Department has listened very well to the community about the needs of the ordinance. I sent an email with a resource that could be useful in the years coming from Other and Belonging Institute, which is part of the Haas Institute at UC Berkeley. They compiled a compendium on policing issues that really are relevant to the AB 481 and its main purpose. So I recommend that to staff. My supervisor, Stephanie's staff, has already reached out to me and thanks me for that resource. So it appears to be relevant and useful. I want to particularly thank the Sheriff's Department for providing in their presentation pictures of the objects that are the rifles and the equipment. That's going to be very helpful for the public. And I want to recommend reading the letters I've sent, which contain further comments about the annual report process and the transparency and the need for the public's involvement in that. I was pleased to hear about the amendments on that and the realignment or the fact that those two reports will be.
Thank you. Speaker time has elapsed. Can we get our next caller, please?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
My name is John Lindsay Poland with the American Friends Service Committee. We recognize the extraordinary engagement of the Sheriff's Office with our organization in the development of the proposed military equipment policy. The result contains all the components required by AB 41 for a law enforcement agency proposal for consideration by a governing body. That said, the governing body has its own set of responsibilities under AB 41, including making its own findings that whatever is adopted will safeguard civil liberties and that there is no reasonable cost-effective alternative to the military equipment. President Peskin referenced the authorization for submachine guns, which are in addition to 90 assault rifles and sniper rifles. There's very little restriction on the deployment of these submachine guns, and that continues to be of real concern to us. The department states that submachine guns was the primary weapon system for SWAT teams in the 80s and is currently phased out. The weapons aren't being maintained, and no one in the department is currently authorized to deploy with it. So we propose to decommission the MP5 submachine gun. The department can always come back to the board if it wishes to phase the weapon back in. Short of decommissioning, we propose 1, that it not be deployed in crowd situations. 2, that deployment should only respond to a threat to life or serious bodily injury. And 3, that variables should be considered prior to deploying the MP5 that could deter its deployment, including the presence of elderly, children, individuals with mental and physical disabilities, medically compromised people, and non-English speaking persons, as has been done with other types of military equipment in this policy. And finally, we haven't seen the sentence that would be removed on chemical agent launchers, but we would like to ensure that it is that the launchers will not be aimed directly
Speaker
at
time
people.
has elapsed. Thank you very much. That was our last remote public call-in.
Okay, public comment is closed, and I note the comments of the last speaker, and one of the policy changes relative to the launchers was adopted in part, at least, by the Sheriff's Department this morning, and the submachine gun issue I spoke to earlier, and with that, I would like to make a motion to adopt the amendments that I discussed previously and have distributed to all of you that are non-substantive according to the city attorney in nature and can be voted on today and sent to the full board. On that motion, a roll call, please.
Yes, on that motion, Supervisor Chan.
So we've had these robots for 10 years now, and they're used majorly for surveillance. So if there was a shooter, the robot would go up there and surveil the situation. But now they want to add bombs and guns to them. My point was that's like a jury-rigged 10-year-old robot. And what could go wrong? Nothing works right the first time. And that they're going to want to get one of these brand new Boston Dynamic robots they're trained to kill people, and then so they're going to come back and want even more money for this, for questionable results.
Yeah, well, yeah, it was stunning when it happened, and I'm really happy that I have had a conversation with John about the lawsuit, and I'm happy that the service committee has stepped up.
Yeah, me too. It's good to have their support. Well, Matt's got to go. I'll take one more question before we close out here.
Okay, I'm gonna say thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, y'all. Yeah, I have a Zoom meeting at 3 and I need to get home for it. So
Okay, all right. Thank you so much.
yeah,
Matt.
it's
I really
it was really
appreciate
great to be here, and we'll talk soon, I'm sure.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right, thank you. Well, shall we have a moment of silence before we close out here? Well, thanks, everybody, for attending. I apologize for the technical issues. If you look at that email that I sent the SF Quaker group, it has all the links to those videos and more. If you want to watch those or have any questions. So,
Well, and thank
If
you for
there-
all the work you're doing, Arthur.
oh, thank you.
Thank
I
you, all
appreciate
right.
it.
And
And